Welcome to Permission to Breathe, a transformative podcast dedicated to providing a safe space where you can inhale deeply and exhale freely while embracing your grief journey unapologetically. I am your host, Dr. Tammy Isaac, a spiritual practitioner, grief advocate and educator, author, and your guide on this journey through grief. This space was born out of the understanding that grief is not just an event, it's a lifelong unfolding. It's layered, it's complex, and often it's silence. And here is where we disrupt the silence. We will talk about the grief that lingers after the food stops arriving at your door, the grief that remains when no one calls and no one comes by to check on you, the grief that's complicated, the grief that's ancestral, the grief that lives in your body long before it ever reaches your tears. Every episode, we honor the humanity of grief, the anger, the confusion, the numbness, the longing, and we do so without apology. Whether you're navigating fresh loss, unspoken sorrow, or the weight of a world that just won't pause, this podcast invites you to sit down, breathe deeply, and give yourself the permission you've been waiting for to grieve, to feel, to breathe. Let's begin. Today's episode is sponsored by Let the Church Grieve by Dr. Tammy Isaac, a compelling book that explores the often overlooked subject of grief within spiritual communities. Dr. Isaac combines personal antidotes with theological insights, providing a compassionate framework for understanding and addressing grief collectively. This book emphasizes the need for spiritual leaders to create safe spaces for mourning and guides congregations through the grieving process with faith and empathy. It's a must-read for anyone looking to support those experiencing grief within their spiritual communities. Grab your copy of Let the Church Grieve at www.drtammyisaac.com today and begin the journey towards healing and growth. February holds layered meaning. It is Heart Awareness Month, and it is also Black History Month. Together, they invite us to look not only at the heart as an organ, but at the weight the heart has carried across generations. Heart disease is the leading cause of death for African American women. That reality cannot be fully understood without talking about grief. Grief is often reduced to death alone, but for many African American women, grief has been ongoing, cumulative, and woven into daily life. It shows up in losses that are rarely named: the loss of safety, the loss of rest, the loss of being able to fall apart without consequences, the loss of time to heal while still being expected to care for others. Black history is not only a story of strength and progress. It is also a story marked by grief that was endured quietly so life could keep moving. African American women have historically held families together while carrying their own sorrow in silence. Over time, that kind of unacknowledged grief settles into the body, and the heart feels it. Chronic grief, prolonged stress affect the nervous system. High blood pressure and sleep patterns and overall cardiovascular health is all affected by grief. Caregiving without relief, emotional suppression, and constant responsibility are not just emotional experiences, they are physical ones too. Grief lives in the body, and the heart often bears that weight. And in this episode, it is an invitation to connect these truths, to understand heart health not as a separate medical issue, but as something deeply tied to grief, history, and lived experience. It is a space to name what has been carried, to reflect on how it has shaped the body, and how to consider what care might look like moving forward. I want you to know that you are welcome here today. This is a place to breathe, to listen, and to honor both your grief and your heart. Now let's take a deep breath. And let's dig in. When we talk about grief, most people immediately think about death, the loss of a parent, a partner, a child. And while those losses are significant, grief is much broader than that. If we limit grief only to death, we miss how deeply it shapes everyday life and long-term health. Grief is the body's response to loss, change, and disruption. It arises when something meaningful is taken away, altered, or never fully available in the first place. For many African American women, grief has been ongoing, layered, and often unnamed. There's a grief connected to carrying responsibility early in life, grief tied to being needed before being nurtured, grief that comes from staying composed while holding fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty inside. There is grief in caregiving without relief and in being strong when there is little space to rest. There is also generational grief. This is grief shaped by history, passed down through expectations, behaviors, and survival patterns. Many African American women were taught directly or indirectly that survival required endurance. Rest was delayed. Emotions were managed quietly. Grief was carried privately so life could continue. Over time, this became normal, but the body remembers. When grief is not acknowledged, it does not disappear. It often shows up physically. It can look like constant tension, disrupted sleep, heightened alertness, or a heaviness that has no clear name. The heart is especially affected by long-term stress and emotional suppression. Elevated blood pressure, inflammation, and cardiovascular strain are not only medical concerns. They are signs of prolonged emotional load. Grief is not a flaw or a failure. It is information. It tells us where loss has occurred and where care is needed. When grief is ignored, the body continues to carry it in other ways. This is why grief must be part of any honest conversation about heart health, not as an abstract idea, but as lived experience. Caring for the heart includes acknowledging grief, naming what has been carried, and creating safe spaces for support. For many African American women, grief is closely tied to caregiving, not as a role that comes and goes, but as a way of life. Caregiving often begins early and stretches across decades. It includes caring for children, aging parents, extended family, church communities, workplaces, and sometimes the entire household. Caregiving can be meaningful, and it can also be exhausting. What often goes unspoken is how much grief lives inside caregiving roles. There is grief when personal needs are consistently postponed, grief when rest feels like a luxury instead of a necessity, grief when help is rarely offered but always expected. Over time, this kind of constant responsibility then creates chronic stress. The body stays on alert. The nervous system rarely has time to settle. The heart works harder, not just physically, but emotionally. And your stress hormones remain elevated. Sleep becomes shallow, and the body adapts to pressure by staying on guard. Many African American women learn to normalize this state. Being tired becomes ordinary. Feeling overwhelmed becomes routine. Stress is accepted as part of life rather than recognized as a warning sign. Grief shows up here too. There is grief for the life that feels just out of reach, grief for moments of rest that never came, grief for support that was needed but unavailable. These losses may not be dramatic or visible, but they are real, and the body keeps track. Heart health is deeply affected by this ongoing strain. Prolonged stress is linked to high blood pressure, inflammation, and increased risk of heart disease. So when grief and stress are unacknowledged, the heart then carries that burden quietly. This is not about blaming caregiving or minimizing its value, but it's about naming its cost. Caregiving without balance, without relief, and without space for grief takes a toll on the body. Now, listen, this is an invitation to pause and to reflect, not to judge how much you do, but to notice how much you carry, to ask whether your heart has had room to rest, to grieve, and to receive care. Grief and caregiving are often intertwined. Understanding that connection is an important step toward caring for the heart in a fuller, more honest way. For many African American women, grief is not only carried through caregiving and chronic stress, it is also shaped by silence. Silence about pain, silence about fear, silence about symptoms that feel easier to explain away than to sit with or name out loud. This silence did not come from nowhere. For generations, silence functioned as survival. It was a way to stay employed, to stay safe, to keep families together, to keep moving forward when stopping was not an option. Silence protected dignity. It protected livelihoods. It protected others from worry. And for a long time, it worked. But what protects in one season can become harmful in another. Silence teaches the body to hold what the voice does not release. Over time, grief becomes internalized. Loss is managed privately. Pain is minimized. Fear is pushed down so responsibilities can still be met. And the body learns to carry emotional weight without outward expression. Now, grief plays a powerful role here. When loss has been repeated or prolonged, many women learn that pain does not stop life, so they adapt. Emotional distress is reframed and something to manage alone. Physical symptoms then are rationalized. Your chest tightens, it becomes stress. Fatigue becomes normal. Shortness of breath becomes something to deal with later after everyone else is taken care of. There is often an unspoken belief underneath this pattern that other people's needs are more urgent, that rest can wait, that help should be reserved for those who need it more. And over time, grief reshapes how seriously a woman takes her own body. After years of being needed, centering personal health can feel uncomfortable, even selfish at times. Seeking medical care may feel like an inconvenience. Slowing down may feel irresponsible. The heart learns to wait even when it is signaling that something is wrong. This waiting then has a consequence. When symptoms are ignored or normalized, heart conditions may go undetected even longer. Chronic stress continues to strain the cardiovascular system. Blood pressure remains elevated. Sleep remains disturbed. Inflammation increases, and grief remains unacknowledged. And the body continues to carry what the voice has been trained to silence. You know, it is important to say this clearly. This silence is not a personal failure. It is not shaped by history. I mean, it is shaped by history, and it is shaped by lived experiences and by the culture expectations that taught endurance as a necessary skill. And many African American women were taught to push through rather than to pause, to remain composed rather than vulnerable. And these patterns made survival possible. They also came with a cost. Heart awareness requires us to gently interrupt this silence. It asks us to listen to what the body has been communicating all along. It invites us to take symptoms seriously without guilt or justification. It reminds us that grief and physical health are not separate conversations. They are deeply connected and intertwined. This is a moment for reflection, not accusation, not urgency, simply honesty. Where have you learned to stay silent when your body needed care? What signs have you been taught to minimize? What grief has been carried quietly for so long that it now feels familiar? You know, grief often teaches us how to survive. Healing begins when we also allow ourselves to listen, to respond, and to receive care without apology. Reclaiming care does not begin with drastic change, but it begins with attention, with noticing what the body has been saying for a long time and allowing that information to matter. For African American women, listening to the heart requires unlearning patterns that once kept life moving. It means questioning the beliefs that rest must be earned, that pain should be pushed through, or that asking for help is a sign of weakness. These beliefs were shaped by history and necessity, but they don't have to define your future. Grief awareness care starts with honesty, okay? So honest reflection about what has been lost, honest acknowledgement of what has been carried, honest attention to physical and emotional signals without minimizing or dismissing them. Now, this kind of care, it includes practical steps, okay? Scheduling medical appointments and taking symptoms seriously. It includes allowing time for rest without justification, creating space to speak grief out loud, whether with a trusted person, a professional, or in the quiet moments of your reflection. It also includes learning to receive care, not only to give it. Now, listening to the heart is considered both literal and symbolic. It involves monitoring your health and honoring the emotional life that shapes the body. So the heart does not ask you for perfection, but it's asking for awareness and responsiveness and compassion. Grief does not need to be fixed or resolved to be honored. It just needs space, right? When grief is acknowledged, the body is no longer required to hold it alone. This shift can then change how stress is experienced, how rest is approached, and how health is prioritized. Reclaiming care is not about doing more, right? It's about doing differently. Not about doing more, but doing differently. It's about choosing presence over pressure and attention over avoidance. As we move through this episode, I want you to consider this invitation to listen inward without judgment, to begin to notice what your heart has been carrying, and to begin to recognize that caring for your heart includes caring for your grief. And your body is not betraying you, but it is simply communicating, and it deserves a response that is rooted in care. Many African American women are not only carrying personal grief, they are also carrying the grief of others. They carry the grief of family members who never had space to mourn, the grief of communities shaped by loss, injustice, and uncertainty, the grief that shows up when something happens in the world and the body responds before the mind has time to even process why or what. This kind of grief is collective. It does not belong to one moment or one person. It lives in shared experiences, culture, memory, and everyday awareness. It shows up in vigilance, in worry for loved ones, in the emotional labor of staying composed while holding concern for everyone else. Black history includes shared grief that was rarely given time or language. Losses were endured in ways that prioritized survival over mourning. Over generations, that grief became something to carry rather than something to tend. The heart feels this collective weight. When African American women absorb not only their own grief, but also the pain of others, the emotional load increases. The body remains alert, stress compounds, the heart continues to work under pressure. This is not because of weakness, it is because of care, connection, and responsibility. This segment invites a different kind of awareness to ask where your grief ends and where the grief of others begin. To notice when compassion turns into overextension. To recognize that carrying everything is not the same as honoring everything. Grief-informed heart care includes boundaries. It includes permission to set down what is not yours to carry alone. It includes choosing moments of rest, even when the world feels heavy. You are allowed to care without carrying it all. I'm going to say that again. You are allowed to care without carrying it all. You are allowed to grieve without holding everyone else together. The heart needs room to soften, to recover, and to breathe. As we come to the end of this episode, I invite you to pause for a moment, not to fix anything, not to make decisions, just to notice. Notice what stirred as you listened. Notice where your body responded before your thoughts did. The heart often speaks quietly through sensation, through fatigue, through emotion that rises without warning. These are not interruptions, they are messages. Black history reminds us of what has been carried, often without recognition of relief. Heart Awareness Month reminds us that the body remembers what the mind has learned to endure. Grief connects the two. It lives at the intersection of experience, memory, and the physical body. For many African American women, grief has not always had language. It has been woven into responsibility, silence, caregiving, and survival. The heart has carried that weight faithfully, but carrying is not the same as healing. Caring for the heart means allowing grief to be seen and acknowledged. It means listening to what the body has been holding and responding with attention rather than dismissal. It means recognizing that your health matters now, not after everything else is handled. You do not need to carry this alone. You do not need to minimize what you feel to be worthy of care. Your heart, your grief, and your story deserves space. Thank you for spending this time with me on the Permission to Breathe podcast. And as always, I want you to be gentle with yourself. And until next time, remember, you have permission to breathe. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Permission to Breathe podcast. I want to invite you to sit with it just a little bit longer. Notice what came up, notice what feels heavy and what feels clear, and know that there's no rush to resolve any of it. You can also read the companion blog to this episode found on my website at www.drtammyisaac.com along with the show notes. If this conversation was helpful, you are welcome to share it with someone who may need it or leave a review so others can find their way here. And join me next Monday for a new episode of the Permission to Breathe podcast. And as always, take care of yourself gently. And until next time, give yourself permission to breathe.